Welcome to Calgary Living. I'm Diane Planet, licensed realtor with eXp Realty, and today we are so excited. We're thrilled to have Ann-Marie Lurie, Chief Economist at the Calgary Real Estate Board, giving her insights and intuitive thoughts on the Calgary housing market and where it's going in the future. Ann-Marie brings a wealth of knowledge. She has been with CREB as a Chief Economist since 2011. Wow, and played a pivotal role in keeping us all on target, on task, and in the know. We're loving to share her insights with you. And make sure you stay tuned to the very end because Ann-Marie is going to talk about where she forecasts the interest rates will go and what's going to be happening in our beautiful country for the Calgary and area housing market. Welcome, Ann-Marie. We are so thrilled you are here today to provide insight and inspiration and a little bit of your crystal ball knowledge for the Calgary and area real estate market. Recently, we were at the forecast where you presented brilliantly, and I'm wondering if you could share with our audience the insights of what's been happening and where we're going in the market for Calgary.
I think the first thing to really consider is when we look at what happened over the past year. Calgary has seen exceptionally strong sales. Yes, it declined in 2023 over 2022 levels, but that 2022 was a record high. So I think when we look at what just happened in sales, they've been exceptionally strong based off longer term trends. So we're doing far better than what we were doing prior to the pandemic. And this isn't a time when interest rates are high. So I think that really some of the unpacking that and looking what's happened, we have had some shifts for sure because of the high interest rates, but we're not experiencing in Calgary what a lot of other markets have. Um, yes, our sales are lower. They have shifted towards more affordable product, no question. Where we are struggling is supply. And while we're hearing this in other markets, we are one of the few markets that is seeing prices rise beyond, like, we hit new peaks last year in terms of prices. And again, a lot of this is to do with the fact that demand has stayed relatively strong, supply hasn't kept pace, and now we're seeing this really strong price growth in our market. So that was kind of 2023. We did see a bit of a shift, and again, I'm just talking about all, some of the key points, but we did see that shift towards affordability. Where was also interesting, and I think something that's really driving our market this year as well, is we're just not seeing any listing growth really in the lower price points. So one thing to note is I actually think our sales last year would have been much stronger if we had more supply, especially in the affordable ranges. I think it's actually been a limiting factor on some of our sales just because let's look at the drivers. Why are we in this situation? Despite the fact we have higher interest rates, it really comes down to some fundamentals. We have exceptionally strong migration into the province, and that's been the number one driver. We've had population growth has outpaced any other province. So we've had, and this is 2 consecutive years of very strong growth in terms of population. We are not just seeing migrants come from international sources, we're also seeing migration happen from interprovincial. And a lot of those migrants are coming from BC and Ontario, which are generally higher price markets. So that's really supporting our activity here as well. The question becomes, why are people coming here? And really it comes down to the fundamentals of we have very strong job growth and a outperforming economy. And this is, I guess, in some ways a different story compared to what we had prior to the pandemic. People often forget prior to the pandemic, our economy was struggling. And the pandemic kind of came in and we saw some shifts in housing. It really reduced the supply in our market, what was already oversupplied. So it brought us back to normal. And then we were faced with really stronger economic conditions, which really drove us into these seller market conditions that we experienced the last year. Now, when we think about some of the factors moving into 2024, there still is the concern of higher inflation, higher interest rates. And while interest rates are expected to come down, this is, for our market, again, that impact of the interest rate hasn't been as significant as some. But there is some risk associated with that. But what we look at it as is, when interest rates come down, that's going to continue to support demand, especially for people who were potentially priced out. Now, we're also going to continue to see that demand supported from the fact that we had no supply. Listings are expected to improve. We should see some gains in listings this year, which should help really support sales growth. Because as I said at the beginning, one of the biggest challenges last year was there just wasn't a lot of supply choice in the market and it limited sales. So if we think about 2024, there's still a lot of fundamentals. We're still working through that additional population growth. We're still working through all of those gains in employment that's going to continue to support housing demand into this year, despite concerns over slower economic growth. So housing has always lagged. So we're going to continue to see that demand. Again, Alberta is expected to be better off than a lot of other provinces, in part because of stronger commodity prices. That does generally help our economy, as well as investment activity that's been happening. That's going to continue to support us this year. So that's going to support relatively strong demand. Now, at the same time, supply levels, there are some signs of improvements. The question is it going to be enough? And that really depends on how the migration numbers look. I mean, migration is expected to slow this year. But that being said, even if it slows a touch, we still had all that other migration that came in, and really we're still playing catch up in our market in terms of supply. We're seeing new home starts rise. We had record levels last year, which is a good thing in terms of adding that much needed supply to the overall market. Problem is, it takes time for that supply to come on. So I think when our expectations into this year, it's important to consider that while supply might start to improve, we have to play catch up with that previous demand, and it'll take time before we move into more balanced conditions. So on that basis, we expect it to continue to see some relatively strong price growth into 2024.
Great. And it really dominoes, doesn't it? Sort of things keep transforming and changing as time goes by, because the last boom, per se, in Calgary saw housing starts almost twice as what they are now. But that was also maybe detached, and we have a lot more apartments. So is that where the price point is increasing the most? Or have you seen a trend or some kind of pattern that's forming regarding that?
Well, I think we have to unpack that in two ways. So first of all, if we think about the housing starts, no question we've seen a shift away from, like, it's not as much detached. We're definitely seeing much more apartment style product. We're also seeing out of those housing starts, a lot more of that apartment style product actually be dedicated towards rental. Rental markets have been exceptionally tight. There isn't much vacancy out there. We've seen some rental construction growth. So that's that nature of where that new product is coming in has changed. And that is really, it's starting to align with a lot of the other larger cities that we see in our, in the country, across the country, that it typically, you start to see a little less detached, a lot more towards the higher density. Now, part of that is because it's more affordable, right? So, and especially in times of a higher interest rate environment, you tend to see people flock towards lower price product. Now, it's pretty hard for the detached market to see a lot of increased growth in the lower price range. It's just difficult for them to build that. So that's where that product of semis and even semis have increased a lot over. So we'll park that for a second. But that's where row and apartment product tend to come in, apartment ownership product, because they come in at those lower price ranges. And that is the area where we're seeing the most growth. So if we really just strip out the new home stuff, just look at resale market activity, those lower priced communities, even on the detached side, they tend to see the most growth. So if we looked at kind of our city as a whole, the Northeast, the East districts, they saw the largest percentage of growth last year compared to every other district. Now, we're also seeing larger price growth in apartment condos relative to the detached. It doesn't mean that detached hasn't grown. And I think that, Last year we saw stronger growth in apartment style product and row style product, which are the most affordable in the market relative to detached and semi. But we have to remember that detached prices and semi prices were increasing sooner. So sometimes you need to take a bit of a longer look at this, just because last year apartments might have increased more. Um, they only recovered in prices last year from their previous highs. So I think that some context needs to be given to that. So even though we're expecting stronger price growth for apartment style product, as well as row style product this next upcoming year, they're almost in a catch up phase. So I think that's just an important consideration. Now, even within the apartment condo sector, the lowest price products are really seeing the strongest growth, whereas the higher price stuff is not necessarily increasing by as much. And it really comes down to the fundamentals of supply and demand. So often what I do is I'll break out, how much inventory do we have in the upper price ranges versus the lower price ranges. Well, what we're seeing is in that upper price range, there is much more inventory relative to demand. So we look at things like sales to new listings ratio, months of supply. Those levels are a lot higher. So that means that really consumers or purchasers have more choice. So that puts less pressure on prices in that upper range. Whereas in the lower price points, there just isn't any supply. I think we look at sales to new listings ratios that are like 90 some odd percent, in the 80% range. That means that, out of every 10 homes that are listed, 8 are selling. So that's not leaving a lot of room to have any increase in inventory. And really that is reflective of those seller market conditions. And it means that they just don't have a lot of choice. So those conditions really drive up higher prices. So I think that on the whole, no question, we're seeing the most affordable range of every product type. Because obviously a $600,000 condo is very different than a $600,000 detached home. But all of the lower price points of each product type, so apartment, condo, rows, semis, they're all really seeing not enough supply, really strong price growth. As you get into the upper ranges of each product type, each property type, that's where we're starting to see that it's still tight, but not as bad. So I think that matters, because if we think about, anybody who's trying to transact in this market, um, if you're trying to move up, you might have a very different experience. If you're trying to buy something in the lower price ranges, it's going to be pretty hard to find product, even if supply increases this year. And we expect to see some listing growth this year, but I might not see that same listing growth in the lower end of the market. So that still will continue to put that upward pressure on prices, especially for more affordable product.
Right? Because where are people going to go?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, if they stay here, where are they going to go? Right?
That's right. And their option is Calgary or just outside of Calgary or leave Calgary. So I think we're always trying to look at what those flows are and where are people moving to and from. And again, if you're coming from a market like BC, or Ontario, you don't view our higher price points as really that expensive for you. I mean, it is relative, right? So, the typical detached home in Toronto might be 1.7 million, whereas Calgary, even though it's increased a lot, it's still in that 600, almost $700,000 range. But that's still far less than some of those markets. So I think that is also some perspective, and likely why, even in the upper end of the market, it has done fairly well, considering how much rates have gone up over the past couple of years.
Oh, yeah, and that's incredible because people didn't budget for that, right? And what I mean by that is, you're saving for a down payment, you want to get into the market, you're ready to move in, and the interest rates changed. And then they changed again and again and again and again. And all of a sudden, something that was, prime, where prime was maybe 1 plus 2%, say on a home equity line of credit, is now prime, 5%, 7%. That's what, triple? I don't know. It's how do you even like plan for that? How does the younger generation, because Calgary is a very young city. Our average
Mhm.
age is what? At 35? I'm not 100% sure. But it's a very young, vibrant city with, like, just so many opportunities for young people. But they wanna start. They wanna get in there. They wanna start building their futures. What would you tell them? What would you say to them that kinda like, is it good? Is it bad? Is it indifferent? Like, when do you know to actually take a leap of faith? Start with the apartment, 'cause that's where the most inventory is and the most affordability, and then plan on working yourself up. Like, should they? Shouldn't they? I don't know.
I think it also depends on their objectives, right? So one thing I always say is we whatever the market's doing, what is your longer term plan? So if I try and put myself into that shoes of if I'm a first time home buyer, am I planning on staying in this city for an extended period of time? Do I like Calgary? Am I going to continue working here? And then if that answer is yes, and you want to look at that for a long time, and you don't want to rent and you want to own, well, then it becomes what type of product can I afford? And there is, one thing that Calgary, we do have options in all different price ranges. Now, will it be a detached home? Maybe not. Or if it is, it might be that it's further out. So it's not that you can't necessarily get a detached home in that, under 500 range, but you might not find it in Calgary. It might be a little bit further out of the city, or you might have to be looking at, commuting from a Strathmore per se, or something like that. So I think first of all, that's what is the priority in terms of, for a first time home buyer? Is your priority to be inside the city limits? Are you okay with apartment condo, or do you want something different? And I think that some of those decisions go down to what's your time frame, what is your objective with housing, um, and what really is that longer term plan. I mean, people, there's more to home ownership, then it's not just about what the market's doing. It's about what is your lifestyle choice. And I often say, like, I don't deal with lifestyle choice because that's not what I do. But if you're
Right, right.
making that, just yeah, that's right. So that's where that decision has to be beyond just here's what the market is doing. There's a lot of fundamentals that's supporting further price growth. Waiting for adjustments because we know that it can happen. I mean, if something changes in your economy, prices can come down. We have seen that before. Usually, it's tied to recessionary behavior or significant job loss, like what we had in 2015. But again, I think that waiting for those sort of cycles to happen, how much could prices increase in the meantime? So I think that anybody who's looking at this would have to kind of assess what, like, do you want to rent for an extended period of time, and it might be that prices don't come down as much. um we have to remember that really when you have price declines like that, it is often accompanied with significant job loss. So and it never necessarily lasts for a long time. So we had a period where prices were declining relatively, for a 5-year period, but now they're up again, and they're continuing to rise because we're having flows into our province and into our city. So if you find something that kind of fits your needs and your desires, again, while there might be short-term fluctuations, longer term there's likely to be some appreciation as long as your city continues to grow. So I think sometimes it's taking out the short term what you're seeing, and having that longer term vision when it comes to housing.
Right, and that's, I mean, obviously, everybody's situation is day by day personally different, but where do you stop and start? Like, I'm hearing rents are getting a little wacko, and to the point where you might as well buy, especially if interest rates may come down a point, and especially if you're just paying somebody else's mortgage. It's just, that timing is so intricate, but the rents that are being charged for what you're getting, or even the homes that are being built and their square footage. And I mean, I toured a home the other day and it was like 1.56 million, and the primary bedroom could fit a king size bed, but that was about it. So the lot lines are getting tighter. The inventory is changing. It's like it's no longer that like, hey, get an apartment, move up to a townhouse, move up to a detached, move up to your McMansion. Oh, start to downsize. That pattern doesn't seem to be flowing anymore. And that's why I posed the question. It's like, where do you start if you're just starting out? And you know, the whole luxury condominium market is completely different because that's where the downsizers kind of have to go because there's not a lot of villa bungalow inventory either.
That's right. So again, that starting point, if your objective is, and again, it depends on what your objective is. I mean, if you want a detached home, you know, does that outweigh, like, so what can you afford? I guess is the first question I'd be asking myself is exactly what price point am I operating in? And I think that you can't really make that decision of what to go into until you know clearly what you can afford. And then it's like, okay, I know I'm in this price point. What can I get in that price range and where? And then it's like, how do we layer that in with lifestyle choices? I don't know if it's always an apartment and then move up. Maybe it's not. Maybe you can get into a row. Maybe you can get into a townhouse. Maybe you can get into a detached house that's not quite in the city and you're okay with that. So I think that part of it is just understanding what your affordability looks like. And as rates come down, and one thing to mention as well is keep in mind that with that stress test in place, you're having to stress test at a much higher rate. So if you're having to qualify at about a 7% rate, if those rates are starting to come down, that'll also change your qualification as well. So just it's always good to keep in mind what is that bandwidth and how much do you want to pay in terms of, a mortgage, right? I mean, there are costs associated with homeownership. Now, there's cost of rental too, and I do agree. Rental rates have come up significantly, and when you look at it relative to owning an apartment condo, excluding condo fees, still is relatively less than necessarily rents right now. And that's not the case in all markets. Like if we look at markets in other parts of the country, their ownership costs are far higher. So again, if you think about it in terms of rent versus own, there is still advantages there, especially if you're thinking about a longer term basis, and you're thinking about trying to gain on any appreciation that might happen should you choose to move up later. And one common thing I hear even on downsizers is where do we go, right? So making that product available, but if there isn't a lot of substitute product, then how do you justify that? And again, that's part of, we'll start to see some changes in what product is being built. I mean, I think what we're seeing now with smaller lot sizes and like zero lot lines is in part to keep the affordability there. Um, and it makes it just much more difficult to find, homes that are on bigger lots and things like that. Um, so I think, or needs renos, right? I mean, we know that for some of the resale product that out there, it might be that it's available, but you have to put some work into it. So I think that there's a lot of options for people. They just need to really, that first step is understanding what you can afford and what you're comfortable with. And then making your decision based off that, and going from there.
Right. And maybe it takes two families to come together and do that. I don't know.
Well, and some of the new product that's being built now is built much more with like secondary suites to
Yeah.
help offset those costs, right? And I think that is something that has been much more common in other cities versus ours. And I think you're seeing some of that change to help people, especially given that interest rates are as high as they are. And I mean, I know there's lots of people say, well, interest rates have been much higher. For sure they have. We are not anywhere near some of the record highs that have been out there. But you gotta think for the past decade, they've been pretty low. So there's people who are just not used to seeing this interest rate environment.
Yeah.
And it is an adjustment.
Well, especially because the price point is completely different. When interest rates were, say, 25% in like the late 70s, you could buy a detached house for 100,000. That same house now is 600,000. So It's like, I don't know.
That's true.
It's a toughie. It's a toughie.
Well, and arguments are your income is higher too now than it was
Right.
back then, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
so it's
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 still
different
painful.
then too. It's so painful either way. I'm thinking about I remember the 199 days or under 2% rates, and that especially over the shorter time frame that jump from 2% to 5%, people feel that, right? And that is something that I think even as we move into the next year, there are people who are going to reassess their housing situation, because some people might have locked in at some of the lows that we saw through that COVID period. There's been a lot of discussion that some of those mortgages are going to be coming due this year, and I think that's going to also cause some people to reevaluate their current situation. Now, it doesn't mean they're all going to move, doesn't mean they can't afford it. I don't think that's the case. It's more a matter of, is that now an opportunity to make a change? And I think that's gonna encourage some listing growth this year.
Right. And, the whole migration thing, which essentially subliminally started when we were at a low because the provincial government was advertising in the other provinces, come to Alberta. Please come to Alberta. And now they're coming in droves and they're like, wait, stop.
Yeah.
Nobody can afford to live here. Like, stop. So that's, the compound effect of what was going on. And now people are like, wait a minute, I'm going to retire. And I have a lot of relocation clients and they're like, yeah, I'm going to retire. I'm going to go to Alberta and I'm going to retire there and I'm going to put $1 million in the bank and maybe spend 6 months in the Caribbean or something, or Florida or wherever, somewhere warm, and enjoy my life. Like, why would I retire and pay, the property taxes in BC or Vancouver, whatever? People measure all of these
Um,
things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and it is interesting. I typically found that people usually would come to Alberta for um, work, right?
Mhm.
If there's a shift in that, that'll be interesting to see if that continues to play out. And I guess the relative affordability does support us. Now, we didn't just have migration from interprovincial; we've also had a lot of international migration too. Now, they are different in terms of the impact on housing. They really do influence the rental market first, because they can't buy unless you've got permanent rent status. You're not a buyer.
Right.
At least for at least next year, if they're going to maintain that policy on a federal level. So I think that some of the supply challenges that we're seeing is really impacting all aspects of our market because of the migration. So that strong international and interprovincial migration means all these people coming here needs a place to live. They're drying up a lot of that rental property. That means those rents are increasing. It pushes more people to ownership, and it really just continues to filter into the whole overall market.
Right. No, definitely. And I mean, you can't really tell people. It's like, oh, sorry, Canada's closed for now until we get our act together and get our pricing down. And especially because there was a point in Toronto, I know Ontario, 50% of the population lives there or something like that. A lot of US companies, especially with the dollar differential, were just buying up properties and hey, having a heyday, renting them out, just sitting on them and watching them appreciate. And I know the governments did take stands, but maybe not soon enough, right? But woulda,
Right.
shoulda, coulda. And but that's why I was really interested in housing starts because the city of Calgary, rather than talking about, increasing that, because maybe builders don't like the interest rates right now either. For them, that's not going to be good for their bottom line. Wants to play with a little rezoning. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. One thing I struggle with, and Calgary has land. We do have land around us, and this is really where we are different. We are different than a Toronto. We're different than Vancouver, that is, basically pinned by mountains and oceans. We can develop. We can add supply should the will be there to add that. And I mean, when we think about home builders, we have seen that they will respond to the low supply conditions. Where there's been some challenges is, yes, they're facing the high interest rate environment. They've had some challenges with labor supply. Um, but a lot of it's also it's that backlog on the administration. So how do they get land that's ready to be developed? It takes time, and if that process is a long time, it takes a long time to get that supply on. Now, so the city has taken an approach of rezoning, and I guess it depends under what they're doing it for. If your intention is just to add additional units, um, I suppose that could work. I mean, if their intention is to add affordable housing, which is what they claim, I'd argue that that's not necessarily going to do it. You know, a lot of that redevelopment might not come in at that price that's considered relatively affordable. So I think that that's another consideration. Um, and again, I don't know what the cost. So one thing I would ask about all of this is does that redevelopment cost more than adding more greenfield development? Um, so if you're going to add new communities, what's the cost of adding more homes in a new community versus trying to redevelop in an existing community? Because my understanding is even in some of that redevelopment and rezoning and trying to add that density, well, sometimes the infrastructure also has to be upgraded. So what does that cost versus doing it in a new community? So doing a blanket rezoning, I mean, you know, there's issues with it obviously for existing homeowners too. If you're in a detached home and all of a sudden your next door neighbors to apartment condo an apartment sort of style complex, then that's a different sort of story, right? Um, Now, again, if it's under the whole premise of how do we increase our units within the city, that is one way to do it. There's also the other, and to me, is it easier just to take on, like, just to keep developing on new land that's available. We do have lots of land available even within the city limits that is potentially under an area structure plan, but there's infrastructure that needs to be done, and what are those costs associated for developers? So if developers aren't building that, the question becomes, well, what are the costs associated with it? They've been increasing. I know the city's increased a lot of their levies that require, that go into the development cost. Well, that cost gets passed down. So what does that look like? And I think that, to me, to truly assess if your intention is to add housing supply, yes, rezoning can do it, but at what cost, right? So what is that cost spread between rezoning and an existing sort of area versus doing something that is on a greenfield? And I mean, a lot of, even when you look at like let's say new condo builds, but they typically are far more affordable in the newer developments. Um, as opposed to what you might find inner city. So again, under what is really the objective? If it's adding supply, where you have to be careful is you also have surrounding areas where there's a lot of land around them too, and you are seeing a lot of construction happen in the Cochrane, in the Chestermere areas, and all around our city. You're seeing that, and again, it's also about relative costs. So what is it going to cost for somebody to own just outside of our city versus you're going to redevelopment a property within the city? What does that look like? And I think that it's a much broader look than, I think, to me, just at just one answer. And yeah, so I don't know if that totally answered what you were looking for, but
No.
I'm more thinking about it on that basis, right? Like, let's look at it holistically as
Yeah.
opposed to just one solution.
Well, no, and I'm really glad you said that, because the infrastructure and the expense of that in an older community is exponentially higher. It is. And I only say that because I've actually spoken to people about this. I've had people ask me, "Hey, can I get rezoned? What does that look like? What can I build? What can I?" And nobody really knows 110% yet, because I think the public hearing's not until April. But the city of Calgary does have a map of what you can do depending where your address is, and etc. So they've already been thinking ahead of what the big picture looks like. But you're right. Who's going to pay for that? And you have to subdivide the land, and you have to rezone, and you have to redo the utilities. Who's going to pay for that? Right?
Yep.
And builders know this. Like if they buy a lot in Calgary, say, maybe a 50s home, maybe it's inner city, doesn't even matter what community it's in anymore, east, west, north, south, the cost of the land depends, right? So they know exactly how much they have to buy that land for, how much it's going to cost to subdivide it, and what they can build. So if you're zoned for two versus one property or four, like we're seeing a lot of that row housing all over the city, to be honest, um, they already know those magic numbers. Now, for the city of Calgary to think the average homeowner who has maybe a good sized lot or a tear down is going to take that initiative, they really need to know what they're looking for. They need to know, it's like, how much is this going to cost me? And is it worth it? Because there's a
Yeah.
magic number depending on the community, depending on what you're going to build. And, it's not for everybody to be building.
That's
so,
right.
so that would pose my next question. Could it be that because Calgary, let's be honest, has a lot of illegal suites already in place, and maybe there's only one hot water tank or one furnace or whatever, but it's a little helper for a person's mortgage. Is it essentially another way of them getting people to register their illegal suites from a tax standpoint? I mean, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but how they would expect people, and I know it's happened in Toronto and other places, to turn their primary residence into like a fourplex or something is beyond me, because that's the infrastructure. I don't even know if it's there in order to provide that, right? And I'm talking about utilities
Yeah.
mainly, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we don't really know how many illegal suites are out there, and I know they're starting to track these registered suites. I'm always curious, is if you made it easier for having people to have more suites in their home, doesn't that also achieve the objective of increasing supply, especially in a rental shortage scenario? But I mean, um, yeah, so that'll be interesting to see if that develops, and I would love to see what those actual numbers are. And just the fact that you're seeing more of the new builds come out with, okay, we're going to build it up with a suite in it already. Then that is something that, again, you're adding supply, but it's, I think, easier to do on a newer property that's under construction versus some of these existing stuff that it's, there's I know a lot of change, a lot of cost associated with getting those suites up and ready. So
Oh, yeah, and to add a suite after the fact is, I don't know, at minimum, like let's say between 80 and 100,000. And it's, you have to know what you're doing. But I toured recently Rockland Park out in the Northwest. It's a new community, and they're building a lot of different types of homes, but all but one detached house had already in the show home a suite. I mean, it was tiny, five,
mhm.
600 square feet. But you're right, like that's the direction we're already going. And I guess I'm just not 100% sure how they foresee, like you said, the average homeowner doing this subdivision of their own homes or lots versus expanding out into the wilderness. I mean, everybody predicted that Calgary and Airdrie would become like one entity by now, and it still hasn't happened. There's still a lot of land in between there, right? And it's all
There's a
about
lot of land in between. And
rezoning,
you're not facing,
regrouping.
well,
Yep.
and you're not facing a commute time. So one thing I do struggle with, even when you look at a push towards densification, I understand why cities like it.
Yep.
But it's not like driving from Airdrie to downtown Calgary doesn't take you 3 hours. It's
Mhm.
not that type of commute. So, and I think that's why you really need to look at it on a more broader basis, in terms of when you think about how you're going to add supply, or because if you do things in a certain way, you could just drive people further out to some of these um, surrounding communities.
Well, and that's true. And suburbs, bedroom communities, they're set up pretty good now. I don't think people realize, The difference, though, they're like really tight, like tight lot lines, not a lot of open green spaces, maybe not a lot of infrastructure or amenities. So eventually, but that would pose me to question the schooling then. Because one of the big questions I get, especially people moving from out of province, is how's the schools? And the schools, for the most part, are great. Public, private, separate, whatever the case may be, what people want. However, there's been a lot of shifting going on with the school systems these days. And people, for example, who lived in Coach Hill, well, they used to stay up on the hill and go to school there, maybe 5 minutes away. And now they're being bused down to the Bowness school system. And there's no guarantee you'll actually even get into school. So I don't really
Yeah.
see the school system keeping up with the demand of all the people moving in, even if they have somewhere to live. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that is a challenge. Well, especially when your population surges as it did over such a short time frame, you feel that pressure in education. You feel that pressure in healthcare. Finding a doctor, that can be a challenge, right? So you need to see, especially when you have that growth, you need to see the response on the public services side as well. And I agree, we haven't seen that same level of growth. And some of that busing, because you've got schools in certain communities that they're an older community now, they don't necessarily, so they have schools that are being underutilized, whereas areas that with a lot of young children, their schools are brimming full. So how do you deal with that? And again, that's a challenge that's been around for a very long time. um, but yeah, that is something to consider, especially as our population grows. I think that the expectation is that we should see some more investment into these areas. But again, as we know, building a new school or having that available, it takes time to add that on. And I think that is um yeah, that lack of guarantee of what school your kids are going to go to. You generally want them in your community if you can. So what does that mean moving forward? Or are there different models to be considered? And again, I don't have answers for that one. Um, I have kids in the education system; they're in there, so and there's some advantages when they're actually nearby. But I think that that's something to, again, is going to be an issue that's going to continue to be fairly important, especially as our population continues to grow.
Right. And that's why I posed the school question, I mean, which is a simple one, but to get denser housing, because you can't expect people who are going to buy apartments aren't going to have children, right? You can't make that assumption.
Yeah. No.
As we get denser housing, what does that look like? And so I'm just trying to think big picture versus new master planned community, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
hook in that new master planned community. And, like Calgary's actually, I think, been pretty proactive with the hospitals, how they've arranged them in different quadrants of the city. But that same kind of program doesn't seem to apply to other infrastructures, especially when it comes to schooling. And that concerns me because if you get more and more people living somewhere, number one, where are you going to park? I don't know. But number two, what does that look like? So but do you think the builders aren't really building because they don't have the resources, or do you think it's because they're waiting for the interest rates, or they're just not getting approved for their plans?
Well, I think they are, like, we are seeing growth in building. So we are seeing much more building activity. I mean, 2023 was a record year for starts. So there has been uptake. Now again, I think that where there was some struggles before, they had some labor shortages. So that really prevented some building happening from earlier. Um, I don't know if that has fully subsided. Like, so there still is some labor challenges, I understand, especially with trades. But that was one of the reasons, really, in the beginning, why we didn't see starts necessarily happen sooner. And depending on, every developer will give you a bit of a different story, but Some of what I am hearing is that some of it takes a long time to get your approvals in place. It takes a long time to get things moving, to actually bring it from here's some raw land fully through to I'm finally building a home on it. And that's also something to consider. So from when we actually have a start that's registered, well, that work was done years ago before you can actually get to that start. So if you know builders want to try and get some more land developed and done, there's a lot of work that needs to go in there. They have to go through the approval process. Um, Now, again, how much red tape there is, I'm not sure. I don't, I can only, from what I've heard from some groups, it does take a long time to finally get to that, process, depending on the stage that they're at. But again, if anything you can do to speed up that timeline will help add supply quicker, right? Now, um, does the interest rates impact it? Well, it does in some aspects because, again, you got to think about they know that they have a final selling cost of this product. Well, if your price because of the higher costs, because they have to fund their costs just as well. And if that comes in that your price has to be so much higher, you still need to have a market for it. There is basically all their input costs have also risen too. I mean, we have to think inflation didn't just impact, grocery stores, it impacted lumber prices, it impacted wages, so it's had an impact on overall cost of construction. So if their costs of constructions have risen, they're going to pass off those costs. They're going to have to make a certain profit or they won't be in business. So that's really that needs to happen. So I think that part of that sort of decision also comes down to can they sell product in those price ranges, and that will help decide. And that's why you're seeing a shrinkage of well, I can get to that price point if I make the lot smaller or I make the house more narrower. And I think that's why you're seeing some of that reaction in the new home building is because that way they can try and hit a price point where there's a lot of demand while still maintaining a level of profitability. A lot of that comes into play. And again, developers aren't thinking, they're making decisions from like 5 years ago. So anything that
Right.
they're doing now, this is not going to come available for quite some time, especially if it's a new field development, right? So it takes time to get that there, and as well as their acreage assessment costs for development have been rising right
Mhm.
through the city. So this is also a factor. It's just the rising cost of development, not just the lending rates. The lending rates don't help. It makes it even more expensive as opposed to if they were lower. But I think that some of the challenge is just the cost of construction itself.
See, now that's a perfect answer because that really encompasses what the new zoning is also going to have to think about, the exact same thing. So I love that you said that because people are still moving to our beautiful city, and it's not a great feeling when you literally have nowhere to go or nowhere to move or everything's bursting at the seams. And I know young families who have had to move back in with mom and dad because their rents went so high. They're like, how do we budget for that, right? So there
That's
has to be some good solutions going on here.
right.
And I think I heard in the States when the last reduction they had in the interest rates, because in the US I think they went a little bit higher than Canada, there was a 40% increase in mortgage applications. So it's so intricate how it can change people's lives like that, right?
It can, and
And
as rates are expecting to come down this year, you will likely see more people come back because now that qualification, that should also adjust, right? So that means that more people are going to be able to afford certain products that maybe were pushed out before. So you're going to see potentially more people come into the market. So and really the solution is often supply. And again, that really is key. Um, when you have a growing population. Like if so supply has to match that population growth to a certain extent. If we think about new home starts, um, usually you want to see it kind of grow at the same rate of households being formed. Because if you don't, and you have more households being formed than new supply coming on, that's where you end up with these shortages. And that's exactly what we've experienced over the past couple of years is that there's just much more people forming households today than the starts that have been coming on. And I think that looking at a broader basis, that really is that solution. I mean, there's been so much discussion on supply and or how do you curb demand? Well, people still need a place to live, whether it's rent, whether it's ownership, they still need a place to go when they move into this city. So, if your solution or you're concerned about the price growth, we've seen it in our market. When you have a lot of supply come onto the market, that naturally curbs the price growth. I mean, we've seen it because we've been able to add supply historically. We have seen that in our market. It's why we've had ups and downs in our overall, price movements over the years, is because we can add supply. Now, if you put restrictions on that, you're not adding supply, and restrictions that have a lot less to do with land and more to do with policy,
Mm.
um, then you're not going to get. If your objective is to keep prices relatively stable, you might not get there if you really are preventing more development. So,
Right, and the majority of people that are moving in, whether they're migrants from Canada or new Canadians, the fact of the matter is that if we have nowhere for people to live, what does that look like? Because, our country does need immigration. We do need new Canadians. We have, the people who are retiring, the baby boomers, where are they
mhm,
going? And then we have the millennial population who are just dying to get into the market. But the middle class per se, it seems to be shrinking, and you're either a renter or have a luxury home now. Or I don't know. It feels like a real imbalance because there's not enough mid-range homes available. Or I mean, not even homes. It could be townhouses. I mean, a townhouse, in my opinion, should not be $1,000 a square foot. So, so how do
yeah,
you say to somebody,
yeah.
like it's crazy, but the luxury market is its own little animal, isn't it? Like especially the luxury detached. Do you find it's very, very in tune with location?
I well, first of all, we have to remember we don't like. I mean, it's like defining luxury to me. Like, really, we're talking about for our market, it's over 1 million, right? That still is not that large of a segment of our market. So, and I think that some people say, well, no, luxury is at a totally different price point. And again, I don't really like. To me, it's a qualitative sort of statement. I look at it, if we just think about it in terms of 1 million plus, it's definitely growing. So we're seeing a lot more properties now fall into that category. Are they classified as luxury or not? I'm not really sure. I look at it as it's million plus. I feel like that's not really your average home. That's got to be on the upper end. Now, where that does well, again, it's seen some growth. We're seeing much more activity in that higher price point. And again, what's so surprising about it is that's been happening at a time when rates are high and been increasing. So that really wasn't expected. Typically, that's the segment of the market that you feel most impacted by. And I think that it points to the fact that we have some fairly strong incomes here. We have relatively high average incomes in Calgary. Um, and in this province, and that supports that upper end more so. And then layer in the fact that we are drawing people here from larger cities that um, go, oh, it's 1 million. That's not bad. That's an average home. So I think that but luxury definitely can be a bit niche, and again, it's how you define luxury. You know, to
Yeah.
me, like there's people who say a townhouse in the middle of the city, it's a luxury. Like to me, I'm like, I don't know. Like that's not like my vision of luxury will be different than your vision of luxury, right? So I think that, keeping that in mind, when I just look at the broader market, I am seeing that there is some growth in that upper end of the market as well. And there are some specific communities that definitely have higher prices. It's not across everywhere. You look outside of the city, some acreage markets, they tend to fall in that higher price point on some parts of it, the west end of the city. Those tend to be more higher end prices, and those markets have also just seen some gains and they've done well. Um, Now, again, it also has to be relative to your location. One thing to note, if you're that, and I mean, you would know this better than me by any extent, but if you're that higher price property in the middle of an area that isn't as expensive, well, you might not be doing necessarily the same, right? So that's always things to kind of consider as well. Is it's also there has to be a location factor to that.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
thing, yeah, one thing that surprised me is in part, again, as I said, that higher end has done so well. But when we look at like certain communities, I've always kind of went, oh, well, the West End, um, prices are quite high there, even relative to the city center. Typically, you see the higher prices in the city center, but the West End has seen some very strong prices and very strong price growth, more so than the city center, even though the price spreads, the prices are quite high on the West End. And I don't know if that's just to do with location. Maybe it is proximity to schools. There's a lot of private schools in those areas. So I think that also can drive some of the higher end of the market as well.
No, you're right, and the West End has actually, now that you say it out loud, has kind of held its own. Even when things started going south in Calgary during the last setback, it was still strong, or it didn't decline like other communities did. And interestingly enough, I preview a lot of homes as well because usually my clients fly in and fly out and power by. But I previewed the comparison of properties. They wanted Eltador, but then they're like, oh, what's this tuxedo? I'm like, it's different than Eltador. And Marta Loop is different. And Killarney is different. However, the homes are the same. So you can take a home that's located in Pump Hill, and that exact same builder will build the exact same property in, say, Montgomery in the Northwest. And the price differential used to be huge. And I mean, it's getting closer, but it used to be like $300,000 difference. And now maybe it's $100,000 difference. So what I'm seeing is people are getting attracted to a community. But if they can't afford that community, there's exact same house somewhere else, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And they have to make that
Yeah.
big decision about location. And if they have children, I mean that's a much harder decision, right? But also, I'm finding people want new, or they don't want to renovate, or they don't want to do any work. They just want to move in. And I don't know if that's impacting some of the older homes that are for sale because some of them have fabulous locations, but
Uh,
they just, I don't know.
that seems to be really common in Calgary. I have to admit, like I've heard continually flocks to new, and I don't know if it's just there's like that fear of cost of renos, um, and it could be just for some of those renovation projects, just the cost of that, and the work of doing that, even though you're on potentially a larger lot. It really it's how does that look relative to new? And I think that sometimes that what happens is that that new price seems not so bad when you factor in, well, how much is this renovation going to cost me? What do I risk with doing the renovation? So I think maybe that Calgarians are just drawn to that certainty of the new, and this is, I know this price. Yes, I have to pay above and beyond what the initial builder for landscaping, things like that. But what's that cost of that reno? So now, does it affect the values of those homes? Well, when we look at resale markets, I mean, home prices have been increasing regardless. Like, so lately, it's like, I don't think it really matters too much where you are. We've seen resale prices rise everywhere. So city center was a little less than potentially some of the other districts in the city. So when we look at certain newer communities, versus like an older resale home, I think that some of the concern really comes down to what is, again, it's always that cost. What is the cost of rent versus new? And what do I have to do to this home to get it to what I? And that's sometimes why we see that shift towards new properties, especially for because again they're building them trying to they keep affordability in mind when they're constructing them. So
Right. No, exactly. So you're predicting for the next year, um, basically the status quo is going to be the same. Perhaps interest rates will come down a bit, but housing prices are going to continue to increase on average in Calgary. Would that be correct?
Yes, yeah. We're
Okay.
expecting yes, we expect that prices are I still expect that prices are gonna go up, across every property type. Some stronger price gains to continue in the apartment, and rural style properties. Again, as I said, partly because they're still playing catch up to a certain extent, and as well as just that demand for affordable product isn't gonna change. Even with rates coming down, it's expected to be a slow sort of adjustment. Um, and things that we got to keep in mind is even if Bank of Canada lowers rates, we might not see the exact same level of move in terms of mortgage lending rates. We've already seen some adjustments happen. Um, so we might not see the same level of move, but on the whole, it's because supply is still so tight relative to the demand that it's going to continue to put that pressure on prices. I still expect price growth in the detached market to kind of persist. Obviously, with the lower price products seeing larger gains in the higher price product, but I still am expecting some pretty broad based price growth this year.
Right, and let us pray that some more product comes on the market. But like we started out talking about this, where are people going to go? And empty nesters or people who should not necessarily be in their own home anymore, they still have nowhere to go. So it's going to be super interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
And we know it takes time.
yeah.
And it takes time for supply to adjust. I've always said that, like, keep in mind, and especially because there's so much discussion over, housing is in the forefront right now, especially on the supply side. I
Mhm.
do remind people, eventually we will see supply come on. We will see a better supplied market. We don't tend to stay in sellers market conditions forever. We do eventually see those things adjust. Now, it doesn't mean prices will go down. No, it just might mean that they don't increase as fast as what we have been seeing, right? And I think that again, we got to look beyond this time frame and going. We're still playing a bit of catch up. We're still adjusting to the massive growth in population we've had. But eventually, we should start to at least start to see more options in the market and having some more supply choice for people who are here. And that will free up some. It'll make more opportunities for people to move. I think one of the challenges, as you mentioned, where are you going to go? So even if you wanted to downsize, well, if you have nothing, if you have limited options, that will limit your mobility, and you're not going to see that resale listing come on. Just like as seniors, unless you're going into a assisted living facility or something with room like that, then you're not adding that supply. So I think that's just something to watch for. And part of when we think about broader spectrum on housing, when we think about challenges in rental and we think about what's happening in all aspects, there's the most of like the low income stuff, like the social housing. Well, if there is funding that goes into that and we see more social housing there, then arguably you could be freeing up more space, and it all works through the whole supply continuum. Um, it doesn't. I just think it's going to take time, and I don't know if I'm going to see it this year, but I do expect to see some supply adjustments. Really, we'll start to feel it. I think by next year, assuming that our migration goes back to normal, and that really is the risk. I always think, when I'm thinking about the market, it's the risk of, what can cause a change, right? So as long as our employment market stays relatively strong, we'll continue to see the strong demand. Now, if migration numbers are stronger than expected, then it's going to take longer for supply to adjust. So that's where we need to always be aware of those general conditions if we think about when markets can actually start to change or really start to kind of return to something a little bit more normal.
Mhm. Yeah, and maybe that'll drive people further north towards Red Deer or Edmonton. I think you mentioned at the forecast, as you go further north, housing gets a little bit more affordable. The price points, benchmark prices are a little bit different than in Calgary. Or is that the same if you go south? say to Lethbridge or something like that?
Well, those markets are still more affordable than we are. Calgary is by far one of the higher. It's the higher price market for sure. It was different in Edmonton. So one thing I pointed out is that in Edmonton, prices actually declined.
Wow.
So whereas Calgary hit record highs in 2023, prices in Edmonton actually fell. And they actually played out as was expected. Like the higher price points, there was much more supply there. That's where we saw some price adjustments, and people shifted towards the lower end. The differences in Edmonton is they had supply. They had supply starting off in the year, so they were in a very different scenario. They had, I think, a months of supply that was almost 5 months
Oh,
at the start of 2023, whereas we were under two. So we had no supply sooner than
right.
Edmonton did, and I think that really does drive the difference. Now they also didn't have the same restrictions on development, so they have been. It's been easier for a lot of builders to add that supply in the Edmonton market ahead of all of this than what our builders faced in Calgary. So I think that's also some of the differences between, this is what happens when you can add supply. You don't see that same level of pressure. They didn't have the same inventory crunch. Now they're facing like they're seeing some challenges now, just because I think that their employment growth has been a lot stronger. So they're attracting more people there. People can still buy a detached home in the 400,000 price range. That's, becoming incredibly difficult in the Calgary market. So there is still options for that. And I think that's going to start to shift the Edmonton market as well. As you go to Fort McMurray and Grand Prairie, they've had different challenges, so they haven't seen the price growth. Now, Lethbridge and Medicine had both faced some supply crunch issues, and they've had some strong price growth. Now, their prices are nowhere near what Calgary's are by any means, but they've also seen some of those same challenges with supply, especially in their affordable product price point. So they've seen some of that same sort of upward pressure on prices. Red Deer has been a lot closer to Calgary in terms of that. And again, Red Deer, its proximity to Calgary isn't that far. Prices tend to be lower, and they have seen some gains though over the past year as well, just because they've had some very low supply levels as well. So ultimately, when I think about the differences across the province, the number one factor that drove stronger price gains was low supply, limited supply based off the demand.
Right,
So,
right. And
like, if your supply is low and your demand's low, then
yep.
it's not, then that's different. But when we look at the two together, that's been the driving difference. Where we're seeing the strongest price growth is consistently where there's limited levels of supply based off the demand.
Definitely, definitely.
Mm.
Well, and the hard thing is how Calgary's cycle of home buying and selling used to be so predictable. The spring market would start, March, April, right? Kind of revolve around, hey, we got to nail this down by May because we want to make sure we know what school we're going to. And are you seeing like the spring market starting earlier again this year, like say February?
Um, well, I think COVID changed a bunch of things. Like, so we kind of went through some periods of unusual sort of activity that kind of impacted, because we do typically, you're right, there's a seasonal factor. Now the question is, are we going to return to it? I mean, we still see less activity in January and December, and that doesn't really change. I think, we're too early on. We don't see February data quite yet. Too early for that. We're still in January. But, when I look at our levels, could spring happen sooner? Maybe. I think a lot of it is driven by listings. So what we're seeing right now in our market is that because we're at such a low inventory level, um, everything, as listings come on, we see sales react. Right. So if there was no listings in a specific month, whether it's spring, summer, doesn't, like, if we don't see that supply come on in terms of new listings, it's impacting the sales. So traditionally, I think when we saw some sales increase earlier, because we did see that in 2022, we saw sales be much stronger a lot sooner. Part of it was people were trying to get in ahead of the interest rate movements. So if we think before rates went up, everyone wanted to get in ahead of those interest rate movements. So we saw sales activity rise much sooner than we would typically see. Now, on the reverse, once those rates, were much higher, then you had people kind of waiting to see. But then with the lack of inventory, now it seems that much of those sales are driven by when supply comes on. So it's like people are just waiting for those options. And it's like as soon as I see listings rise, I see sales react in the same way. Now,
Yeah.
once as we're into a more normal conditions, we'll probably fall back into our typical seasonal behaviors. um, but I think that because we first dealt with just people wanting to, react based off interest rates, that changed the seasonal factors. And now I think that just the limited inventory is also changing some of people's behaviors until we really reach something much more typical. And we haven't seen inventories this low since 2006. So,
Right.
so
So,
everything's yeah,
yeah.
everything's and we're bigger than we were in 2006. Our population is much higher. So,
Right.
yeah,
No, I know. I know. So, any final words of wisdom you can give our community and literally people across the country on where the housing market is going to be for the next couple of years? Maybe you could just summarize it, and because we talked about so many different variables here today, but just
yeah.
a little big picture summary.
Sure. I think that really the key fundamental is we continue to see growth in our overall economy. We're having relatively strong growth in our economy. We're still seeing some very positive factors on our employment market. This is going to continue to support demand this year into next year. So we continue to see that demand growth. It's going to take a little while for supply to adjust. And because of that, we expect some pretty strong price gains to continue this year as we move into 2025. Um, as supply continues to address, we should see that pace of price growth return to something much more normal with what you would expect with housing. But for the next couple of years, we're still going to really reap those benefits in terms of price growth, and see that strong gains because of that activity that we've had over the past couple of years.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see where the interest rates end up over 2024, but fingers crossed they do come down a little glimmer, a little glimmer. I'm a firm
Well,
believer.
and they're expected to come. And I think that another thing to note is a lot of that is based off the fact that the national economy is slowing. So I think that's where some perspective needs to be given. So even though our economy is outperforming a bit, a lot of that is based off the fact that slower economic activity is expected in Ontario and in BC.
Right.
And their consumers, our consumers feel it too. We're not immune to the high interest rates and the inflation, but thanks to our strong job numbers, it's helped to offset some of that impact, and even the fact that our population has grown. Well, retail might not be as impacted as necessary some areas, right? Because just more people coming here means that it's helping to mitigate the fact that people are potentially spending less. Individuals are spending less. So I think that when we look at the interest rates and what's expected, if they're expected to come down over the next 2 years, um, it's going to take some time to get there, but they're not necessarily going to go back to that really low level that we had prior to the pandemic.
Right. Yeah,
So
because
that's another consideration.
somebody
Yeah.
has to pay for all that. Right.
Yeah, so it's so it's a little bit different than what we've been in, and I think I think a higher rate, like this rate, is still considered too high what we're currently at. um you know but we're not expected to go back down to those lows that we had before. So,
Right.
but they should
Cool.
slowly start to at least trickle down, and it really will just continue to support the activity that we're seeing.
Well, and that's great, because if nothing else, people want to be in the know. Because I'm just one person who can share what I know with each individual client per se. But I think this today, you providing your insights is just going to provide so many people just like, oh, okay, good. I know a little bit more. Maybe I can, you know, log in or watch those stats every month that come out about the housing market and just kind of be one and understand how everything is constantly shifting and changing. And your hard job to predict people and what the economy is going to do, it used to be far more predictable, I'm going to say, but it provides just a little glimmer of insight to people because, for the average person, they're sitting there going, oh, what's the Bank of Canada going to do today? Oh my gosh, is my line of credit going to go up? I'm down. Can I buy that house? Am I going to have enough for a down payment? And it's just, today you're just kind of like, hey, this is the facts. This is what's happening. That, 80,000 people are moving to Alberta this year or whatever it was. I can't remember this. So when, people are informed, it's easier for them to make those decisions because buying a property, whether it's an apartment or detached or whatever, it's the most money people are ever going to spend. So I really appreciate your time today. And thank you for coming on the show and sharing your expertise with everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Ann-Marie Lurie with the Calgary Real Estate Board. We are so grateful for all of your insight. And I know people making a move to Calgary, or even if you live locally, appreciate your expertise and your insight because it makes us all feel so much more at ease. I'm Diane Planadin with eXp Realty, ready to help you make a move.